Hello kiddos, it's me, Mrs. Thorson, coming to you live from Bunker 167. Today we are going to talk about public opinion and political action. This is Chapter 6. Public opinion is the distribution of the population's beliefs about certain political issues and policies, and we measure this using a science of demography, which is the study of population changes. We look at how public opinion fits into different demographic groups, and the way that this is recorded is through a census, which is taken every 10 years of the entire population of the United States, and actually this has been done since the U.S. Constitution was created. Over the years, our population has definitely changed in the United States. We've seen major demographic changes, and we saw it through three major waves of immigration. The first one, from about 1830 to 1860, we saw most immigrants coming from Northwest Europe, and then by the late 1800s to the early 1900s, we saw major waves from Southeastern Europe and Asia. And then in the latter half of the 20th century, we saw a major influx of immigrants from both Asia and Latin America. So we've seen our demography change over the course of the United States. We are a heterogeneous society, which means we have many different cultures, which has made us into what many call a melting pot, where it's a mixture of cultures and ideas and different peoples that has made us one true, unique American society. We are also seeing a change where the minority is becoming the majority, where we see an emergence of minority groups together that will make up the white or the non-Caucasian society's majority, probably sometime soon in the near future. And this has created and even changed our political culture, which is the overall set of values which is shared widely by society. Some has changed, but a lot of it stayed the same. You know, as Thomas Jefferson said, a difference of opinion is not a difference of principle. We all have, with that, he's talking about our political culture. Looking at this graph here, you can see the emergence of the minority, where the minority groups will soon become the majority. The white non-Hispanic population is decreasing at a much more rapid rate than the other groups are increasing, but you can see of the four major minority groups, the fastest growing minority group in the United States is hands down the Hispanic Americans. Each minority group is definitely experiencing different situations and circumstances in the United States. African Americans, of course, have had a long history of racism in the United States that's dated back to the age of slavery, and then even with civil rights acts being passed in the 1950s and 60s, there's still been some examples of racism and de facto segregation throughout the country. The biggest problem that Hispanics are facing are problems with illegal immigration. Even laws that were passed in the 1980s, like the Simpson-Mazzoli Act, made it so it was even more difficult for Hispanics to get into this country legally because it required employers to document their citizens as citizens' employment. So if you weren't a citizen, you wouldn't be able to work in the United States unless you had some type of green card or visa. Asian immigrants, their situation in this country tends to be one of professional working. They tend to get jobs in the professional areas, or if they are coming here, a lot of them come to colleges and universities, since we have some of the best colleges and universities in the world. Native Americans, of course, as we've learned in U.S. history, definitely are the most disadvantaged group of the four major minority groups. Not only has there been immigration waves throughout the centuries, but we've also seen a major wave of immigrating within the country. We're seeing a major shift of the population move from the east to the west and from the north to the south. With that comes reapportionment, where the seats in the House get sent to new, more populated states every 10 years. So you can see, looking at this map, that this kind of distorted map, that in the beginning in 1940, a lot more House seats were in the north and in the east, and now they have been moving more south and west. Like you can see major states increasing in size like Florida, Texas, and California. The population is also changing, and as we've learned in U.S. history, you should know this, that there is a graying of America where the baby boomers are starting to retire, and we're seeing a large influx in the elderly population. We see the fastest growing age group in the United States is over 65 years old, and they are now diving into Social Security, and that system seems to be draining very quickly. It's a pay-as-you-go system. The people who are working pay for those who are retired, and then the people behind them will pay for them when they retire. In 1942, when the system was just starting up, it started in the 30s, but once we really started to see people actually get paid from it, for every 42 workers was one recipient. But now we're seeing that by 2040, there's only going to be 2 workers for every 1 recipient. So it's draining pretty fast. We're having some major problems with it. Next, I want to focus on how Americans actually become politically socialized. What makes them think the way they think? What forms their ideology? The way that it's formed is through political socialization, which is the process in which someone at a young age is informed of what type of political orientation they should follow. The number one influencer of your political socialization, of your political ideology, is definitely your family. Now, that could come in one of 2 forms. You can see this is definitely what I should be and what type of political ideology I should have, or quite the opposite. You could look at your family and say, yeah, that's not what I want to do. Either way, they're very much the most influential factor when you are learning your political ideology. The next source of political socialization would definitely come from the media. Now, this usually happens as you get older, and the older you get, the more likely you are to get your news from television, and that's when we see a generation gap between viewing television news and reading a newspaper. Usually the younger will view the news, older might read a newspaper. School also influences you. Now, it's not like your schools have it where they indoctrinate you and tell you you have to believe this political ideology over another, but what they do is schools teach you how to be good citizens in a hope that, eventually good citizens will feel the need to vote, and they will get to an older, more informed stage of their life where they feel like it's necessary to vote because they've been taught to be educated and good citizens in school. You also see at this chart that the older you get, the more likely you are to participate in politics, probably because you know a little bit more, you've lived in the real world, and you understand how much politics and government really do affect your lives, which is why politicians tend to pander to those who are older, because they know they're the most likely to get votes out of them, since they'll actually show up to the polling places. The way that the government and politicians find out what people believe and what public opinion is through polling. They measure this through different ways. Now, what they'll do is they'll take a sample, which is a small proportion of the United States, to ask questions about and poll, but they need to make sure that it's random so that they can get it as accurate as possible. So they try to make it random, so they make sure not to get a certain demographic, like a group of people who tend to be of a higher age range, or certain ethnic groups. So they want to make sure to try to make it as random as possible, but to be as proportionate to the different groups as possible. A sampling error does occur because they know they won't always be 100% accurate, since not every single person in the country is getting asked a question. So whenever you see this, you usually see a poll that will say plus or minus 3 percentage points for a margin of error, because they know that the number can't be 100% accurate without asking everybody in the country how they feel. Politicians will use polls to look at them to see how the public feels about certain policy. With that, they can kind of form their idea of how they're going to vote on certain policy agendas. However, many critics say that by using polls, they don't lead the country. They just follow what's being done rather than using their expertise to lead and do what their citizens voted them in to do. So we see that it's kind of a paradox. We're not really sure which way a politician can go. Both sides have good and bad arguments. Now, sometimes it's hard to understand polling because sometimes the question can be worded that could affect the survey. It's biased, and if people have a biased poll and see results, they might be skewed in a way that isn't necessarily accurate. Other polls can be used by the media that could harm the election process, like exit polls, which are used by the media to predict what the election will turnouts will be, and what the who will be the election day winners. And it actually discourages people to vote because they might see that, oh, automatically candidate X is definitely going to win, and I want to vote for candidate Y, so why even go? And that actually happened in 2000 with the presidential election in Florida. A lot of people saw that NBC, CBS, ABC were making early predictions, and it discouraged them from going to vote. And that was a close election. You know, it took weeks before the United States actually found out who won that election, and that was decided by the Supreme Court. Lately, polls have given us an idea as a country how our Americans feel about political information. Number one, it shows that we have a very ignorant electorate. And I don't mean ignorant like they're a bunch of jerks. I mean ignorant as they don't know much about politics. They know their basic beliefs about politics, but they really don't know what's actually happening in the government. And the trust for government has definitely declined. We don't just blindly follow the government and feel like they can do no wrong. After Vietnam and after Watergate, we see a major decline in the trust in government. Now, it did go up a little bit after 9/11, but Watergate and Vietnam really did ruin America's trust for government. Now, if you know your dates of Vietnam and Watergate, we're talking 60s and 70s, you can see that this graph totally proves that. You can see that when it says, the questions being asked is, do you trust the government to do their job the right way? Most of the time, never, some of the time, or always. Now, always is pretty steady. You can see that at the bottom. But you can see the change in people trusting it most of the time declined, and that people who say they never trusted it or barely ever trust it shot up right around Watergate and right around Vietnam. And then it shot up a little bit again around 9/11, but then just went back to people not really trusting the government. Political ideology is basically a coherent set of beliefs that people have about politics, public policy, and just public purpose and what the government does. Are people liberal or conservative? Well, if you just look at it as liberal, conservative, moderate, we don't look at it as the actual quadrant we saw in the political compass, about 38% consider themselves conservative, 24% consider themselves liberal, and a good 38% consider themselves moderate. When it comes to the gender gap, women tend to be much less conservative than men. And when it comes to your ideology, religion plays a major part in that as well. When it comes to political ideology and the voters' thought process, this is pretty much what we see when it comes to polling. We see that when people go to the polls, about 42% actually vote based on their group benefits. How will it benefit their group, whether it's your ethnicity or your political ideology? People, about 24% vote on the nature of the times. They're like, I don't care if I'm left, right, middle, whatever. Is it good or bad, and who's in office? If someone's in office and the economy's great, I'm voting for that party. If the economy's terrible, I'm just going to vote the opposite. 22% have no issue content. They just kind of figure, oh, who would be funner to hang out with? That's about it. Only 12% actually vote on their ideology. They are known as ideologues, people who vote based only on the issue. They don't look at left, right, anything. They vote on their issues, what their belief is, and then make a decision based off of that. People who have strong political ideologies tend to be involved in political participation, which is all activities used by citizens to try to either influence politicians, influence elections, or influence policies passed by politicians. The conventional participation would be voting or even working on campaigns for certain groups, but there's also unconventional participation as well. One such unconventional participation in politics would be protesting, which is just a form of participation that's designed to achieve policy changes through a very dramatic and unconventional way, where someone, for instance, a strike would be an example of that. If a teachers union was really upset about the administration not paying them money, they could strike, which means that they would stop working and stand outside of the school administration building and picket and say their grievances. Civil disobedience is another form of political participation where people refuse on purpose to follow certain laws that they feel are unjust. This was created by Henry David Thoreau. He came up with the idea. Gandhi used it with the Salt March. We saw, of course, those in the South, and Martin Luther King use it. The SCLC and SNCC, they would do the sit-ins where they would go to whites-only restaurants and they would break that law because they thought it was unjust. When it comes to politics and public attitudes towards the scope of government, people don't really understand the scope of government, so they really can't connect public opinion with the scope of government. The one thing you can say is that people are fickle and their beliefs are inconsistent. So they might want one thing, but they want the other, and they're not really sure what they want. So that can cause policy gridlock because the government really doesn't know what to do, what the people are going to want, because it could change any day. When it comes to democracy, public opinion, and political action, Americans select leaders, but do they do it wisely? We saw only 12% of Americans select based on issues rather than the, is it good for me? Do I like their personality? Do they, is it a good time and they're good? People base their decisions based off of performance, not necessarily policy. Someone might pass great policy, but if the economy's bad, they're going to get blamed for it, even though they passed a lot of good policy that could be good for the future. And that's just how people vote. It's very normal, and it can hurt or help democracy depending how you. The moral of the story with public opinion and political action is this. American society is a multicultural society, very ethnically diverse and constantly changing, constantly moving, so that causes politics and public opinion to change constantly. Knowing public opinion is important, and we do that through polling and data like that, but you need to understand that polling does have its costs as well as its benefits. Americans know very little about politics. Political participation is very low in this country, but the reason is because we are a great country that really has no major problems, so people don't really care to go to the polls. You see voter turnout very high in places like Iran, for instance, in the 2007 and 2009 elections, because things were really bad there and people wanted it to change. When people think that life is okay, they're not going to really care about politics. They're just going to let things keep going on as they are. All right, that's it for today. I'm Mrs. Thorson. Out.